Welcome to Notorious Minds. I am M.R. Parks. Notorious Minds is where we examine those that have altered destiny and changed human history. Warning, this video contains violent content, graphic images, and descriptions which may be considered disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. This is Pure Evil, the case of Andrew Urdiales. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Andrew Urdiales was born on June 4th of 1964 in Chicago, Illinois. Little is known about Andrew Urdiales' childhood, but in June of 1977, shortly before his 13th birthday, he beat the family dog to death with a baseball bat and told his parents that the animal had been fatally injured in a fall. Andrew was described as a loner, or someone who had difficulty engaging in small talk. He graduated from Thornridge High School in Dalton, Illinois in 1982. He was given the graduating senior label of social outcast. He had a few friends and joined the U.S. Marine Corps a short time after graduating high school. Between 1984 and 1991, he was stationed at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in California. Over the next 8 years, Urdiales completed combat training. He was trained as a radio operator at Marine Corps Base and then served in Desert Storm. He received several promotions during his military service, but was later demoted when those under his leadership refused to obey his order. Then one day, a security guard making his rounds at Saddlebrook Community College saw what appeared to be a mannequin laying in the college parking lot. Because it was dark, the officer backed his vehicle up to take a second look. The figure was located next to a Chevrolet Citation in the area of the parking lot that was pretty isolated. When the officer saw the large pool of blood, he immediately knew it was a body. Two students walking to their cars saw the body as well and identified the victim as Robin Brandley. Ms. Brandley had just left a party at the Fine Arts Building. A detective from the Orange County PD noticed that the victim had been stabbed numerous times. She was stabbed in the neck, in the chest, and in the back. She also had defensive wounds on her hands from trying to ward off her attacker. The body of Miss Brandley revealed her dress had been pulled up past her waist. Andrew Urdiales had just committed his first murder. He saw young Robin on January 18, 1986 at Saddleback Community College in Mission Viejo, California. He stalked the 23-year-old communications arts student. He grabbed her from behind, stabbing her 41 times with a knife. There was virtually no evidence, and the police could not find a motive for her murder, so her case became a cold case for 11 years. Later, after he was captured, he would confess when he finally was caught that he said he had a bad temper and that he saw Robin. He said he remembers that he was mad about something, and he said, I just started stabbing her for some reason. 2 years later, on July 17th of 1988, Julie McGee, a 29-year-old prostitute, was picked up by a John. Her remains had no ID and her body had been mutilated by animals, which made it difficult to identify her at first. She was shot with a .45 caliber pistol. Her body was found partially burned in the Cathedral City, California. Her body was in the desert for a few days. Police viewed her case as an isolated incident, and eventually the case went cold. Urdiales would later confess that he said he raped her but didn't remember anything after that. 2 months later, Urdiales then killed Marianne Wells, a prostitute in downtown San Diego. She was 31 years old. Marianne Wells, whose body was found by police, shot once behind the ear on September 25th of 1988 in an abandoned warehouse. There was a cartridge casing left at the scene as well as a used condom, which had the victim's DNA as well as the unidentified assailant, but the assailant's DNA did not lead to anyone. Then, in 1989, a man was walking in the desert and found the body of 18-year-old Tammy Irwin, who was a prostitute and was picked up by a John and driven to a remote area in Palm Springs. On April 17th of 1989, there were several cartridge casings left by her body. Eventually, detectives from San Diego County and Riverside compared notes and realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. In 1991, Andrew Urdiales was honorably discharged from the Marines and moved back with his parents in Chicago. Then on September of 1992, however, he returned to California on a holiday. On September 27th of 1992, Jennifer Asbenson was living in Palm Springs, California. She was a nursing assistant working at a home with physically and mentally challenged children. She worked the midnight shift as a nurse's assistant, and she had already been late 3 nights in a row, and her job threatened to fire her if she was late again. As she was walking to the bus stop, she saw the bus pass her by. Then, as she was on the brink of tears, a nice man pulled up and asked her if she needed a ride. So against her better judgment, she got into his car. When he pulled up to her job, he asked her for her phone number. So Jennifer, not wanting to hurt his feelings, gave him a fake number because she thought that she would never see him again. Then Jennifer got off work at 6 a.m. the next morning. As she left her work, a car pulled up beside her, and it was the same man that gave her a ride the night before. He asked her could he take her to breakfast, and Jennifer said no, she didn't have time to do that. As Jennifer began to walk away, the guy said, "At least let me give you a ride home." Since Jennifer did not want to take the bus, so she got into his car. Then the man tells her, "You gave me the wrong phone number." He said, "I called the number, some B answered the phone." Until that moment, Jennifer thought the man was a pretty nice guy. The man then grabs her head and slams it into the dashboard. He then opens the glove compartment, and Jennifer sees a knife and a gun. He ties Jennifer's hands behind her back. Jennifer saw the man's face instantly transform into a demon. He reached over her and leaned her seat all the way back into the lying position. Then he proceeded to drive Jennifer out of town toward a remote area in the desert. She watched as telephone pole after telephone pole passed her by. She knew at that moment she probably would never come out of that desert alive. He finally stopped the car, and he took her seatbelt off and raised her seat up. He violently took out a knife, and he just reached underneath her sweatshirt and did a flick of the wrist and cut and pulled off her bra. He then did the same thing with her underwear. He then shoved her underwear in her mouth. He climbed on top of her lap, and he was sitting towards her, looking right into her eyes. All she could see was rage. That's when she knew that he had done this before. She had been at his mercy for 45 minutes. He then tried to rape her, but he couldn't perform. That made him really, really mad, and he started to beat her. Then the violence level started to escalate. He started squeezing her neck so hard she felt her face getting hot. Her vision started to get weird. She realized that he was going to murder her. Then everything went black, and suddenly, all of a sudden, she could feel pain again, and he was grabbing at her and bashing her head against the side of a car. He resuscitated her just by blunt force. Then he pulls her out of the car and throws her onto the ground. He kicks at her, and he goes and opens the trunk, and she then sees a large collection of knives. When she saw it, she decided, "I want to die," because that was the only escape from this maniac. That's when she started screaming at him. She started calling him moron and pervert. She told him to go F himself, and then she started yelling at him, "I'm not afraid to die, just do it, kill me." He grabbed the back of her head and shoved the gun into her mouth. She said she just couldn't stop imagining the back of her head being blown off. The longer he kept the gun in her mouth, the more she knew he wasn't going to do it. She had taken the fun out of killing her by asking him to kill her. He then took the gun out of her mouth and shoved her into the trunk. When he shut the trunk and started to drive off, she was lying in the trunk on her back with her hands still behind her back. She started to panic. Then she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother always told her, if you ever need help, if you're ever in a bad situation, pray to God. So Jennifer started praying out loud, and miraculously she got this burst of energy. She said she could feel the rope on her hands loosening up, and miraculously her arms were loose. She then started pulling on the fabric by the locking mechanism on the trunk. Once she moved the fabric, she started using her fingers against the locking mechanism, and the trunk flew open. The car pulled over and stopped, and Urdiales shut the trunk again. But Jennifer then heard the wheels spinning as Urdiales tried to drive away. She realized he got stuck in the sand and flipped the trunk lid again as she jumped out and started running as fast as she could. She was naked from the waist down and then looked behind her and saw Urdiales chasing her with a machete over his head. She then saw a truck coming towards her, and 2 Marines stopped the truck. The 2 young men who saved her life wanted to chase him, but she told them, no, he's got a gun. The guys took her to the gas station and they called the police. The police didn't believe her at first, and she argued with the police. The police thought maybe she had gotten in a fight with her boyfriend. Really? Unbelievable. Even her mother didn't believe her, so Jennifer didn't take her case any further. She just went back to everyday life. Of course, she had no idea that in the years leading up to her abduction, there were several murder cases where bodies were dumped in the desert areas throughout Southern California. 4 different agencies were investigating those murders, but their cases had gone cold. This was his pattern: find women, usually that were either vulnerable or alone, and then at some point he would assert control over them. Jennifer thought she was accepting a ride from a nice guy, but unfortunately he turned out to be a monster. For 3 years he committed no murders due to fear of being discovered. Then 3 years after Jennifer Asbenson was abducted, then on March of 1995, Urdiales saw a 32-year-old sex worker, Denise Manley, in Cathedral City, California. He had seen her before, and this day he drove up to her and forced her into his car. He drove her to a remote desert area. He tied her hands behind her back and forced her to have sex with him. There he put a gun into her mouth and blew the back of her head off. He undressed her and left her body for the scavengers. After that, Urdiales went back to Chicago. Chicago had 3 similar murders. All 3 women had their hands tied behind their back. All 3 women were naked. All 3 women's bodies were dumped in a body of water, and all 3 women were shot with a .38 caliber handgun. The police determined that the bullets were fired from the same gun. Urdiales believed he could just as easily commit murders in Illinois. Now, Urdiales worked as a security guard in a Chicago mall. He enjoyed his great trust among customers and in his family environment. So he crossed the state line into Bloomington, Indiana in April of 1996, where he murdered 25-year-old Laura Ulacki. He shot her twice in the head, then he threw her into Wolf Lake. Her body was found on April 14th in Wolf Lake, Illinois, on the border of Chicago and Cook County. Urdiales took her clothing in order to slow down the investigation. And in Hammond, Indiana, on July 14th, in 1996, police found the body of 21-year-old Cassandra Coram in Vermilion River Mountains in Livingston County, Illinois. Coram was seen talking to a man and then getting into his vehicle. Duct tape covered her mouth and she was shot once in the head. An autopsy later showed she was stabbed 7 times in the chest and head. On August 2nd of 1996, the body of 22-year-old Lynn Huber, another prostitute, was found naked floating in Wolf Lake. Huber is presumed to have been Urdiales' last victim as well. So the Chicago police determined that the bullets were fired from the same handgun, but they had no clue who that might be. In 1996, a Hammond police officer by the name of Warren Fryer saw a pickup parked outside a crack house. So he called backup and waited for the other officers to arrive. He then approached the truck of Andrew Urdiales. The officer noticed a revolver in the vehicle and yelled "Gun!" to the other officers. Another officer retrieved the gun, which was a snub-nosed, chrome-plated revolver. It was fully loaded with 6 bullets. Since Urdiales did not have a permit for the gun, he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, and the gun was confiscated. As the truck was about to be towed, the officers noticed how spotlessly clean the inside of his truck was, as well as the truck bed, like it had just was driven off the showroom floor. The officers also found rolls of duct tape. Urdiales soon bailed out on the charge, but was later convicted on a misdemeanor unauthorized weapons charge. On April 1st of 1997, Officer Fryer received a call about a man and a woman fighting in a motel at the American Inn in Hammond. The man said a prostitute had stolen something from him. After interviewing the known prostitute, she told him Urdiales seemed weird, that he wanted to take her to Wolf Lake and handcuff her in the back of his pickup and have sex with her. It concerned her because she remembered hearing all about the other prostitutes being murdered. The officer noticed the similarities between what she had described and some of the other incidents that had occurred in the area. The officer didn't immediately arrest either persons, but the officer then later went and checked police records. The Chicago police officer checked Andrew Urdiales' record. He noticed the gun charge, that in December of 1996, Urdiales was arrested for possession of an unlicensed weapon and had a misdemeanor conviction. Officer Fryer then made a report and sent all the info he gathered to the homicide detective. The detectives then pulled the gun out of evidence and took it to a gun expert. The gun was later linked to the bullets of the three homicide victims, Urdiales, Coram, and Huber. Once the detectives from Chicago PD confronted Urdiales, they told him they had unresolved questions about his previous gun charge. They asked him where did he get the gun from. He said he purchased it from Calumet City for $300. They asked him, has it ever been out of your possession since you purchased it? He said no. They told him his gun was a match to a string of murders in the city. He said, well, I guess I'm not going to work today. He took off his security badge, loosened his tie. He then provided details of the three murders. He also said there were some murders that police in California might be interested in. Up to that point, police in either state did not connect the murders. Urdiales explained to officers McGrath and Krokowski that he met Laura Urdiales sometime during the winter of 1996. They had gone out on dates a few times. He said that they'd had sex on 2 occasions at Wolf Lake using a sleeping bag Urdiales said that he kept in the back of his truck. It was in April of 1996 he said that he picked up Urdiales and they again went to Wolf Lake. Along the way, an argument broke out between them. When they arrived at Wolf Lake, Urdiales took his .38 caliber revolver, which was loaded underneath his driver's seat, and was showing it to her when it went off, and it shot a hole in the roof of his pickup. Laura got mad and all hell broke loose. Urdiales told the cops that Urdiales had attempted to grab his gun and had broken his left index finger. During the struggle, unable to gain control of the situation, she jumped out of the truck and tried to run away. Following after her, Urdiales said he fired a couple of rounds at Urdiales' direction as she chased after her, and she fell on the ground. Urdiales went over to her and determined that she was dead. It was then that he said that he decided to toss her body into the lake. Before throwing her body in the lake, Urdiales said he undressed her and took her clothes with him. He said he threw her clothes out of the truck from the passenger side on the drive back to Chicago. Urdiales then told the detectives about the murder of Lynn Huber, whom he met during the summer of 1996. Huber, he said, was working as a prostitute in Chicago. Urdiales said that he and Huber had sex on 2 occasions, and on an evening in late July and early August of 1996. Urdiales said that he saw Huber carrying a large bag and that he stopped and offered her a ride. He said he drove her into an alley where he and Huber could have sex. He claimed that she had begun arguing with him and started acting kind of dingy before trying to get out of the truck. Urdiales said that he grabbed her and shot her in the head with the gun he kept under the driver's seat. After he killed her, Urdiales said he placed her body in the bed of the truck and drove to Wolf Lake. As he removed Huber's clothing, he said he pricked his finger with a needle and said that pricking his finger made him angry, prompting him to take a knife and stabbing the body. He said that he stabbed her a few times in the back and afterward he had shot her again. He then took her new body, threw it in the lake, and left the garbage bag. Then he looked in the bag that Huber was carrying and examined the contents and discovered that it contained clothing. He took the clothing that Huber was wearing along with the clothing in the plastic bag and gave them to the Salvation Army because he said Huber won't need them anymore. What he described to officers McGrath and Korenkowski would conclude that their serial killer's eighth and final victim. Urdiales then said he had known Cassandra Coram for about 2 years before killing her. On July 13th of 1996, after meeting each other at a bar in Hammond, Illinois, the two had driven to Wolf Lake to have sex. Her body was found the next day, floating in the lake. At one point, Coram had said something that angered him. He couldn't remember what resulted in him striking Coram in the face several times with his hand, and frightened by his violence, Coram panicked and began to fight back, which is what had prompted him to handcuff her hands behind her back. Urdiales had then removed her clothing and described Coram as seeming numb with anxiety and fear and passive and submissive. He then bound her feet with duct tape and placed duct tape over her mouth. He said that he was still pissed off about whatever Coram had said, that it angered him as he was driving south on Interstate 55 with a terrified, bound and gagged naked woman lying on the front seat who was about to be killed. After driving about 2 hours, Urdiales began to get tired and decided to exit the interstate. He continued driving, however, and eventually crossed a bridge that led to a small park where he stopped and shut off the truck's engine. He said that he and Coram got out of the truck and he grabbed his gun from underneath the seat on the way out of the truck. After walking to the back of the truck, Coram, still naked, had turned to face Urdiales as if she planned to say something when Urdiales shot her. After she had fallen to the ground, Urdiales says he, still being angry with Coram for the earlier altercation, had taken out his knife and stabbed her a few times afterward. That he dropped her body into the river from the nearby bridge and threw her clothing out the window as he drove home. As he explained, he was trained to kill in the Marines. He claimed that he did not feel any sympathy for her. He said she was just a bimbo. Wow. He then said, by the way, you might want to call the Southern California police and talk to them about some murders that I committed there. Then California PD received a phone call from the Chicago detectives, and they started giving them particulars on these murders, and they realized right away they're associated to cold cases, and within an hour the California police were on an airplane headed to Chicago to interview Urdiales. Urdiales gave a full tape confession on his crimes to the California police detectives. He then tells police about a victim that got away, which was Jennifer S. Benson. Urdiales said, she gave me this fake phone number. He remembered all the details about his crimes. He even remembered Jennifer's name. So in 1997, police showed up at Jennifer's house about her assault and kidnapping. It only took apprehending a serial killer that they finally believed her. In 1997, she went down to the police station and a detective said, I'm going to lay out some photos. All you have to do is show me the man that did this to you. She said, it's this man right here, and she pushed the photo toward the police officer. He said, well, this man is a serial killer. He's murdered 8 women and you're the only one that got away. Jennifer said that testifying in court against Urdiales was very liberating for her. She was able to tell her story for all the victims that could not speak. On April 29th of 1997, an indictment was brought against Urdiales. However, legal and political debates delayed the trial's opening for 4 years. The question was whether Urdiales should be punished with the death penalty. At that time in Illinois, there was a discussion as to whether the death penalty should be completely abolished. And on April 30th of 2001, the prosecutors decided to request the death penalty for Urdiales. The trial for the murders of Urdiales and Huber opened on April 8th of 2002. Urdiales was found guilty of the two murders on May 23rd of 2002 and was sentenced to death 7 days later on May 30th of 2002. Urdiales' case became a political issue for a short time after a study by Northwestern University concluded that some death row inmates had been innocent, and that innocence no longer could be judicially recognized. The governor of Illinois, George Ryan, determined on January 11, 2003, that all 160 people sentenced to death in Illinois at that time would have their sentences commuted to life, never mind that Urdiales had confessed to all his crimes. Therefore, his first death sentence was commuted. Subsequently, the prosecution prepared an indictment for the previous unresolved Cassandra Corum's murder case. It was opened on April 24th of 2004. Urdiales was encouraged by his defender, Stephen Richards, to change his tactics, pleading guilty but claiming that he was mentally ill. Presiding Judge Harold Probish nonetheless resentenced Urdiales to death on May 10th of 2004, and then it was commuted to life in prison. On March 2011, when Governor Pat Quinn signed into law legislation that abolished the death penalty in Illinois. At this time, Urdiales was incarcerated in the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. California prosecutors, within hours of the Illinois Governor Quinn's decision to commute Urdiales' death sentence in that state, prosecutors in Orange County, California, sought to extradite Urdiales to be tried in California for the murders of 5 women in the 1980s, when Urdiales was stationed in the Marines at Camp Pendleton. After he was discharged from the Marines. On May 13th of 2018, Urdiales was convicted in the murders of 5 Southern California women. On Wednesday, June 13th of 2018, a jury rendered a death verdict for Urdiales. The jury deliberated for 1 day. On October 5th of 2018, Urdiales was again sentenced for the 3rd time to death. Urdiales would say later about himself that he was physically and emotionally abused by his parents, according to court records. Not that that is an excuse for murder. Then, on Friday, November 2nd of 2018, his death sentence was carried out at around 11:15 p.m. Urdiales was found unresponsive in his cell in the Adjustment Center of San Quentin State Prison. Urdiales was alone in his cell, and the prison's officials say that it was apparent that his apparent cause of death was suicide by hanging. He was 54 years old. Thanks to a courageous lady, Jennifer S. Benson, this man got the judgment that he deserved. May all those that died under his hand rest in eternal peace. This is Notorious Minds. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and by all means subscribe to my channel. See you next time.